I thought when we first started talking about it, what was really interesting to me was the media's responsibility in reporting on communities of color, right? And we look back at 1912 or 1921 and we look at 2012 and we see the difference, right? In terms of who had the power in the media then and then who has the power now to really tell the true stories. I also understand, and I think that social media plays a big part in that, because we as citizens become journalists because we're content creators. So what we see every day is something that we're reporting on. I think that's one of the reasons why we have a little bit more stories coming from our communities. I think the other part of it is that for us in this country, we've never really dealt with the issue of race in a thoughtful way. And what's really interesting to me is if you look at the past 90 to 100 years, we've never truly been accountable as a country to the atrocities and genocide of various communities of color specifically. But I think it can definitely be related to interfaith communities, and the LGBT community can also respond to it. And we just tend not to really be accountable. We just kind of push past that. The media plays a part in that because we focus on the crisis, but not the solution. And so, to me, this film really kind of speaks to this. This gives a context to the history in America as it relates to race. And I think it's a first step towards healing, because then when you truly understand it, then it's not really about the Trayvon Martins of the world happen as a one-off. There's a context that we have this undercurrent of rage because we have this undercurrent of lack of understanding, and we don't really connect as communities. So I think that this film can really help us bring people together to understand it, to be more accountable, to reconcile, to build communities beyond just the ones that we live in, which are quite siloed by color, by gender, and so it really kind of breaks down many of those walls.
It's really a lot of good points in there. I mean, there's several really key things, but I have to say that the arc of the history of what happened here, that in 1921 there was a bloodbath, and it was a bloodbath in the most successful African American community in the country, really probably in the world at that point. And we never treated it as a Holocaust, and Tulsa never healed its wounds. And so when the Good Friday shootings happened a year and a half ago or so, all of a sudden the whole community was up in arms and wondering if the police, if the city was going to take it seriously, because they didn't take it seriously before. And when I heard about the Good Friday murders, I literally, and this is not the way films always come to me, I literally sat up and said, oh my God, this is a film, because of what had happened in 1921, because of how the death toll is still occurring over the issue of race, that we haven't gotten beyond that somehow. So I think the inspiration for doing this, looking at the big picture of what's going on in our country, including situations that don't turn out so well, like the Trayvon Martin case. But in this case, in Tulsa, progress was made. The city got serious. We actually got somewhere that we hadn't been before. And that process of healing is where I want people to go when they watch the film.
What do you think will happen after people actually see the film? Do you think that it will kind of start a conversation on race? Do you feel like just for them to see the film by itself is enough?
I think it's hard, I think it's extremely hard to have an honest conversation about the issue of race in our country. We are all so kind of programmed to be careful about what we say. Did we say African American, or should we have said black? God forbid we said colored, you know. I mean, what is politically correct has become the focus of our attention, as opposed to what do we need to do to get better?
Right.
What do we need to do to not have situations where two white guys go into a black neighborhood and start shooting black people? What are we going to need to do as a country, as a nation, to stop the hate crimes from happening? And that's dialogue.
You know what I think is really interesting about the film that's so unique? the fact that we don't have a narrator, that the story is truly told by the people who are invested, impacted, interested in the story of Tulsa, right? And what we've done is created this conducive environment that allows people to come in and just be themselves and share their perspectives without judgment. And you really, sometimes it's a little bit shocking because you're not expecting some of those perspectives. You're expecting someone who happens to be a woman to speak from that perspective, but instead maybe she's speaking from her race, or a gentleman who's speaking more from the fact that he grew up in Tulsa as opposed to the fact that he's a white male. And so I also find that it helps us understand that there are many dimensions to identity. And so when we start to have a conversation on race, I think that's one of the reasons why it's difficult, because we have an assumption that you're a white woman, this is what you'll assume, and this is what you'll think. And I'm a black woman, and then this is what my perspective is. But I may be speaking from the perspective of someone who's actually from New York, whose grandparents are from Italy, right? And so I think it also helps us uncover that a little bit more and have a more intimate and authentic dialogue with each other, because we're there and we're present and we're watching this film where every single perspective is actually welcomed. And that is the tapestry of this story, just as America is filled with so many diverse thoughts and perspectives. And so to me, this story is a reflection of the entire country.
You know, it's intriguing to hear you talk about the perspective of the entire country. I know when we interviewed Charles Ogletree, for example, he talked about, as opposed to thinking of it as the melting pot, let's think of it as the salad. We don't want the green pepper to taste just like the lettuce, to taste just like the tomato.
Right.
We want all these different flavors. We don't want to dilute ourselves or to become each other. And there is an image in the film which is strangely powerful. It's a sign on a highway of three people. It's like they're silhouettes and they're running, and the little kid is being almost held in the air. They're running and pulling that little kid. Mm-hmm. And clearly they are immigrants. They are not wanted. They are the other. But as you look at them, they could be anybody.
Right.
That is the not desired person. That is the person, because of them, I don't have a job. Because of them, I'm not, whatever it is that we push away and say it's that other. That sign tells us that we get frightened of and therefore angry with the other. And that's really what this film is about.
It's interesting that you talk a little bit about the immigration piece, or all these various aspects that have to do with these social issues in our country, right? Because when we're talking about hate crimes and racial violence and injustice specifically, you have to look at the economy. You have to look at the fact that this was Black Wall Street, right? How many years after slavery was this community able to really bring themselves up into, per capita, right? The largest community, if you will, in the Black community. And then for there to be a genocide. So what happens to the Black folks who live in Tulsa? Now we look at the disparities in education and the economy. If you don't know anything about the race riots that actually took place, and you look at the Black community in Tulsa today, there's an assumption that Black folks maybe don't have certain accesses to quality of life because of something that they've not done, because there's no accountability for what actually took place beforehand. So I think there's an opportunity for us to actually broaden the conversation beyond, yeah, sure, we have a lot of issues that have to do with race, but when we don't address this and we're not accountable and we don't put it in our history books and actually say this is what took place, then you have no understanding as to why there are disparities when it comes to the economy, why there's disparities when it comes to education, why certain communities that are just a few blocks away look so different, not only because people look different in terms of their color, but also what they're able to afford. There's a reason for that. So you're really providing a context, or we are providing a context, right, to tell this story of America, the ramifications of racial injustice, the ramifications of hate crimes, if you will.
And that's why it's so great that we've got our partner organizations, the Harvard Institute for Race and Justice, for example, the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. This is the third film that we've worked on with them. They are they've been involved in Tulsa for decades, trying to get this case heard in Tulsa, in Oklahoma, at the Supreme Court level, trying to get reparations made to these survivors of this terrible, terrible Holocaust in 1921 and their descendants. And it's been a long haul. Just this year, in fact, in our film, we will be revealing the chief of police of Tulsa today actually apologizing, finally, for the collusion and the involvement of the police in 1921. Couldn't have been more different in 2012,
right,
when the police put together the biggest manhunt that ever has been done in Tulsa to find these two guys, put their ear to the ground in the Black community to help find these two guys. And the state accepted a justice outcome, I guess, that normally isn't accepted in Oklahoma, of not going after the death penalty, but allowing them to spend the rest of their life in prison without parole.
I think there's something to be said about that, because even in the film, you have so many people who ask that we not go for the death penalty because they feel there's enough killing. And so what does that really mean? I mean, what are the penalties? What is the value associated with a killing of a Black person versus a killing of a white person? I think that is also explored in a way. But that was pretty powerful to me, to hear people from the community not demand the death penalty, an eye for an eye, if you will, but instead really wanting to come towards reconciliation, that we've had enough and we want to bring our communities together, because will it really heal us if they're put to death? Probably not.
That notion of finality, that notion of completion, is a false notion. You know, there is no satiation for retribution. There's no, there, you never are. It's never enough. Well, they were killed, but they didn't suffer like my sister or daughter or brother who suffered so much. And it's a very interesting, we find that the Black community is divided in Tulsa about how they feel about the death penalty, with some people saying, you know, this guy should never breathe air again. These guys shouldn't have the right to breathe air. And yet other people arguing pretty profoundly for sparing their lives, which is what has happened.
Right, it's interesting to look at this national conversation on race and how there's been a demand for it, but it's been really difficult to create one. And what I think is really interesting now that the film is completed, for us to be able to tour the actual film and have community screenings and localize the conversation, and then bring those people who are connected online so that they can continue the conversation. We're actually pushing the envelope and creating a national conversation on race. And when folks ask, well, what is it that you think you'll accomplish by using this film as a tool? You know, part of me feels like this opens up the discussion. It reflects the film. We welcome everyone's perspective. We feel like there's an opportunity to provide context to our history and our present day circumstances. We bring people together, greater awareness and education. But then I also leave it somewhat open, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too. I leave it open because I feel that it's not for us, right, as filmmakers, to say, this is the solution, but instead to leave it open for the people of this country to say, this is what we need. So we've heard some of the voices and we have that in the film, but I'm really interested to hear, as we tour around the country, what does everyone else have to say about bringing communities together? Will they say it's too difficult and we don't have an interest? The same as you have this difference between this within the Black community in Tulsa. Some of them want the death penalty because they want some finality and they want it to mean something. And then others say we've had enough of the killing. So I think we'll be able to really explore, in terms of the national conversation on race and hate crimes and racial injustice, other people's perspectives. And I would imagine that it won't be all one solution, but there will be many for us to really kind of come together and create some level of healing. At least that's my hope.
It's interesting that you mention what is attractive about the film and to who. This film was made handmade by people in Cincinnati, by students, by faculty at NKU, by people who are not necessarily uber involved in civil rights work, if you will. It's not everybody's first cup of tea, and yet it attracted people to give, to work, to do, and it became a symbol of the national situation. I think that Jesse Jackson really focused well when he said, Tulsa, unlike some of the areas in the country, the leadership welcomed the presence of Jesse Jackson after these murders took place. And so I think that this film has the ability to translate through the generations into new generations who can look it up on Facebook, who can have a dialogue online.
Right. It's interesting, one of our partners at City College, at Aaron Davis Hall, where we'll have our New York premiere, he talked a lot about how he was an activist during the civil rights movement, and there was some frustration with him, with his 16-year-old, because he felt, what do you care about? And I hear that a lot from different generations. The younger generation doesn't care, right? And then what you hear from the younger generation is, there's so many problems, which one should we care about? And what can we really make an impact on, right? And as we started to have this discussion, what he revealed to me was that he had to take a moment and realize that his child, who's 16 years old, is an activist in his own right, but he's an activist online. That's where he puts all of his pleas. That's where he shares his voice. So while it looked like activism for him in the streets, whether it was marching or peaceful demonstrations or what have you during the civil rights movement, there's still activism here, but this new generation does it in a different way. And their voices are there online. So I'm looking forward to capturing so much of that and having that spur a conversation with their parents and their grandparents as well.